This is part one of a two-part study on the times of the Gentiles. I mentioned during our chapter-by-chapter study of Revelation this phrase, but I knew it was too complex a topic to go into in depth during that study. Now that our chapter-by-chapter study of Revelation has wrapped up, I felt this was a good opportunity to circle back to this topic. Now, the phrase "the times of the Gentiles" is found only in the Gospel of Luke, and it's found in chapter 21, verse 24. But starting back in verse 20, we read, "When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that its desolation has come near. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. Those inside the city must leave it, and those who are in the country must not enter it, because these are days of vengeance to fulfill all the things that are written. Woe to pregnant women and nursing mothers in those days, for there will be great distress in the land and wrath against this people. They will be killed by the sword and be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled." 2 nights before he was arrested, Jesus and his disciples were in Jerusalem. This was during the Holy Week, and their custom during that week was to spend days in Jerusalem and spend their nights in Bethany. As they were leaving Jerusalem, the disciples commented on the beauty of the temple and its massive stones. Jesus told them that not one stone would be left that was not thrown down on top of another. On their way to Bethany, Jesus and his disciples stopped on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples asked him a question. It's actually one question in 3 parts, or you could say it's 3 questions. Now, we have to harmonize this discourse across the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, to identify these 3 specific questions. They are, when will these things happen? Specifically, when will the temple be destroyed? What will be the sign of Jesus' return? And the third question was, what will be the sign of the end of the age? Now, part of the answer to the second question is found in that phrase, until the times of the Gentiles is complete. But what is the times of the Gentiles? The answer to that is found by studying Daniel, chapters 2 and 7. Now, the times of the Gentiles, before we jump into Daniel, the times of the Gentiles, simply stated, is the period between the Babylonian exile and the second coming of Christ. The latter event is something no one knows. The when is kept a mystery by God for a very good reason. If people knew the day or the hour, they might just be tempted to kick back and relax a little bit until the last minute. God does not want this from his people. He wants us to be living and serving as though his second coming is imminent. But Daniel prophesies a series of 5 empires that will come before the second coming of Christ. These include the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which existed from around 626 BC until 539 BC. Now you see on the slide it says 586. That is the time the exile of Judah occurred. The second empire is the Medo-Persian Empire, which existed from 550 to 330 BC. And the Medo-Persian Empire did not conquer the Neo-Babylonian Empire until 539 BC, and that is when they took control of the Holy Land. The third kingdom is the Greek or Hellenistic Empire. This slide is wrong. I believe it's like 336 BC until 30 BC is when the Greek or Hellenistic Empire existed. 323 BC is when the Greeks conquered the Judea, the land of Israel, the Holy Land. That was under the leadership of Alexander the Great. And then the fourth kingdom mentioned by Daniel, it's more of a series of kingdoms. It's an imperialistic form of governance. And that started in 63 BC when Pompey sieged Jerusalem and made Israel and all the surrounding territories as like vassal states to the Roman Empire. And the fifth kingdom is the millennium or the Messianic kingdom. Now, that fourth empire, imperialistic governance, is present today and will continue until the second coming of Christ. It started, as I mentioned, when Pompey marched into Jerusalem in 63 BC, conquered the city and the surrounding territories, and made Israel part of the Roman Empire. It was the Roman Empire that developed this imperialistic form of governing. Although the Roman Empire no longer exists, this form of government is a dominant form of government in many parts of the world today. Now, the Fifth Empire will be the Messianic Kingdom, as I said, what many Christians believe will be the millennial reign of Christ on earth for 1,000 years. This study, part 1, will focus on those first three empires. These have all come and gone. Now, before we take a look at those kingdoms, before we take a look at those empires, I think it's helpful to do a brief overview of the history of Israel from the time of Abraham until the Babylonian exile. That kind of puts us into the context of why this exile was necessary and how Daniel's prophecies just continue a plan by God to carry out his overall plan of salvation being made available to the entire world. Now, in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, we see the Abrahamic covenant. Beginning in verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt, and all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." There were three basic parts to this covenant as shown here. First, there was the land covenant. That covenant has not been completely fulfilled yet. God promised the area to Israel, and it would be much greater than what Israel has ever occupied and what they occupy and control today. The second part of the covenant is that Abraham, formerly known as Abram, will be the father of a mass multitude, a great nation. The name Abram means exalted father. At the time, Abram did not have any children, so his name might have been a bit embarrassing, especially since he had no children. Before he had children, his name was changed to Abraham, which means father of many nations. So if somebody were to come and he would introduce himself, "My name is Abram," they might say, "Oh, exalted father, how many children do you have?" And he'd say no. And then later, when his name was changed to Abraham and he introduced himself, somebody might say, "Oh, you must have a lot of children." And he would say, "No, I have none." So a bit of an embarrassment to him, but there was a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Now, that third part of the covenant is the one that is of particular interest to us, Christians, especially Gentile Christians. It says, "And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you." This part of the covenant was fulfilled when Jesus was crucified, buried, and resurrected. Through Abraham's descendants, the Messiah would come and be the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. So we have Abraham, and Abraham was promised that he would be the father of a great nation, and eventually this promise came into fruition. We start with Abraham, and he had a son named Isaac, who had a son named Jacob, who had 12 sons that became the 12 patriarchs of Israel: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, and Benjamin. Now, of those, as far as the timeline of Israel's history, Joseph is the most significant. Of course, we all know that, well, maybe we don't, maybe we do, maybe we don't, but it was from Judah would come the King David, and from King David would come Messiah. So Judah's lineage is critical to salvation history, but Joseph is the next significant figure in just the overall flow of Israel's history. You see, Joseph, he was the most influential over this next period of Israel's history. It's a familiar story. His half-brothers sold him into slavery out of jealousy, and Joseph ended up in Egypt. He distinguished himself and became the second most powerful man in Egypt. It was Joseph who managed the response to a worldwide famine, saving the lives of most of the people living in the Middle East and North Africa. It was during this crisis that Joseph was reunited with his family, including the brothers that sold him into slavery and had no idea where he was. And he used his influence to bring them to Egypt and settle them in Goshen. Now there, the Israelites, they thrived and they grew in numbers. After the generation that included Joseph and his brothers died, a new Pharaoh enslaved the Israelites. This enslavement lasted 400 years until the time of Moses. The story of Moses is another familiar story. Moses was born a Hebrew slave, but he was raised in Pharaoh's household. We are familiar with the story about how his mother put him in a basket and Pharaoh's daughter plucked him from the water and raised him as her own. But later in life, he murdered an Egyptian, had to flee to Midian, a wilderness area east of Egypt, and he remained there until God called him to return to Egypt so the Israelites would be freed from captivity. This was not the work of Moses, but it was the work of God through Moses. After a series of 10 plagues, Pharaoh allowed the Israelites to leave, but then he changed his mind and he pursued them. God parts the Red Sea, the Israelites passed through safely, but when Pharaoh pursued them, he and his army were swallowed by the sea and destroyed. About 2 years after this event, the Israelites wandered across the wilderness and stood near the border of the Promised Land. They sent 12 spies into the land. The spies returned agreeing that the land was indeed good, but 10 of the 12 spies argued that the inhabitants of the land were too big and too strong to conquer, and the cities were too well fortified. Only Joshua and Caleb dissented, arguing if God promised them the land, all they had to do was claim it. Since the Israelites lacked the faith of those 2 men, God condemned them to wander the wilderness for 40 years until all the adults alive at the start of the Exodus were dead, except for Joshua and Caleb. Now, once that generation died, Joshua became the leader of the Israelites, and he started the conquest of the Promised Land. And he started by beginning with the city of Jericho. The initial conquest lasted about 7 years. Now, towards the end of his life, Joshua called the people to renew the covenant between them and God's chosen people, and God himself. So Joshua chapter 24 is where we see this covenant renewed. But Joshua told the people, "You will not be able to worship the Lord because he is a holy God. He is a jealous God. He will not forgive your transgressions and sins." Specifically, he's talking about idolatry, embracing the foreign pagan false gods of the land they were told to occupy. Picking back up in verse 20. "If you abandon the Lord and worship foreign gods, he will turn against you, harm you, and completely destroy you after he has been good to you." "No," the people answered Joshua, "we will worship the Lord." Joshua then told the people, "You are witnesses against yourselves that you yourselves had chosen to worship the Lord." "We are witnesses," they said. "Then get rid of the foreign gods that are among you and turn your hearts to the Lord, the God of Israel." Obviously, the Israelites were still holding on to some of those idols, some of those foreign gods. Verse 24, "So the people said to Joshua, 'We will worship the Lord our God, and obey him.' But they did not. The people continued to embrace the local pagan culture and the foreign gods. God allowed the enemies of the Israelites to oppress them until they cried out for help. God answered their prayers and gave them judges that would lead them and rule them on his behalf. So as we enter the time of the judges, which lasted from about 1380 BC until 1045 BC, it's important that we understand who these judges were. These were not judges in the way that we understand them today. Men and women who wear black robes, sit behind a tall bench and listen to evidence and make rules based on interpretation of law. Yes, that was part of what they did, but the law that they interpreted was God's law. Their mission was not just to act as judges between the people or for the people. They were also political, military, and religious leaders, and they served in a way as prophets, speaking on behalf of God. Now, the first of these judges was a man named Othniel. But some of the more notable judges that their names might be familiar include Gideon and Samson, and of course Samuel. Now, Samuel was the last judge, but he was not just the last judge. He remained a prophet, and he was the one who anointed the first two kings of Israel. Now that came about because the people were crying out to Samuel. They said, "Your sons do not walk in your ways. They do not walk in the ways of God, so we need you to appoint us a king to lead us just like all the lands around us." We can read 1 Samuel 8 and see where this happens. Starting in verse 6, when they said, "Give us a king to judge us," Samuel considered their demand wrong, so he prayed to the Lord. Instead of just getting mad and saying, "No, I'm next in line to be the judge. Why are you taking this opportunity away from me?" he prayed to the Lord. But the Lord told him, back on verse 7, but the Lord told him, "Listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you. They have rejected me as their king. They are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. Listen to them, but solemnly warn them and tell them about the customary rights of the king who will reign over them." God gave them fair warning. If you have a king over you, the king has certain rights, and you may not always like it when he exercises those rights. The bottom line is God gave people over to the desires of their hearts, and he told Samuel, give them what they want. Now the first king was a man named Saul, a Benjaminite. Saul started off good, but he disobeyed God at Gilgal. Because of this offense, God told Samuel that Saul's line would end. His heirs would not succeed him to the throne. Moreover, the Spirit of God left Saul, and Saul was tormented by an evil spirit. He became paranoid, ultimately committed suicide on the battlefield instead of being captured and tortured. And then David, a servant of Saul, he ascended to the throne. Now Samuel had also anointed David to be the next king. However, at the moment that God said Saul's heirs would not succeed him to the throne, God also told Samuel to go anoint the next king. And that was 15 years earlier, while Saul was still king, that Samuel anointed David as just a boy to be the next king of Israel. This added to Saul's paranoia and his unsuccessful efforts to kill David and pass the throne on to one of his sons. Now after David died, his son Solomon ascended to the throne. Samuel was dead, so Solomon was anointed to be king by Zadok, the high priest, during David's rule, and he remained the high priest during Solomon's rule, at least the early parts of it. Now, after Solomon, the kingdom ended up being divided. So Solomon dies, his son Rehoboam ascended to the throne, but not without controversy. The 10 northern tribes of Israel did not accept Rehoboam's rule. They end up murdering his minister of forced labor, and they anointed Jeroboam to be their king. Jeroboam was an advisor to Solomon, but he was in exile at the time of Solomon's death. So the united monarchy of Israel was split in half. The northern tribes of Israel had a series of kings that followed Jeroboam. All of them were judged bad and said to do evil in the sight of the Lord. Because of their constant rebellion, God allowed them to be taken into captivity and exiled around 722 BC. These 10 tribes were exiled throughout the Neo-Assyrian Empire, and they were integrated into the local customs, cultures, and people. They all but lost their identities as being part of God's chosen people. They became known as the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Now in the south, the tribes of Judah and Benjamin were all that was left. They had a series of kings, and most of them were judged bad, but not all. In 586 BC, they were taken captive by the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And this is when the times of the Gentiles starts. You see this map, and it covers some of the same territory that the Neo-Assyrian Empire covered, where the Babylonians took over and defeated the Neo-Assyrians. And at this, they took many men into captivity into Babylon, many of the Judahite men. We'll see that in the next slide. Daniel chapter 1, beginning in verse 3. The king, Nebuchadnezzar, ordered Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them the Chaldean language and literature. Among them from the Judaites were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Now Daniel, again, you can see it right there. Daniel was among the men that was exiled, but he was brought into Babylon, and he was one of the men that was told, train these men up for service in the Babylonian Empire. As a result of that, each of these 4 men were given Chaldean names. Daniel was given the name Belteshazzar. Hananiah was given the name Shadrach. Mishael was given the name Meshach. And Azariah was given the name Abednego. You might recognize those last 3 names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These were the men that were thrown into the furnace because they refused to worship any god but the one true God. God intervened, and they were not consumed by the fire. But before going into the furnace, they declared that God could save them, but even if he chose not to, they would not worship any god but the God of Israel. What an important lesson, what an important example for us today. Even if we often pray for things and we feel like God does not answer our prayers. Sometimes, well, all the times, sometimes the answer is no, and no truly is an answer to the prayer. And so they say, even if. As we pray for things in our lives, we will ask for things in Christ's name, but we need to understand that even if he says no to that prayer, that no is an answer in and of itself. Now, this information is found in the book of Daniel, and Daniel is the one that describes for us the times of the Gentiles. That's why we're looking at this. But it starts with the exile and Daniel, because Daniel is the one who will give us all of those details. It starts in chapter 2. In the 2nd year of his reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams that troubled him, and sleep deserted him. Now, the 2nd year of his reign would have been 584 BC. That's an important day to pay attention to, because some of the prophecies that Daniel gives, the prophetic interpretation of the dream, and then later on a prophetic vision that Daniel had, occur after this date, which means God revealed this to him before the events occurred. Some of the events had already played out, and we'll see that as we go through this study. In the 2nd year of his reign, 584 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams that troubled him, and sleep deserted him. So the king gave orders to summon the magicians, mediums, sorcerers, and Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. When they came and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had a dream, and I am anxious to understand it. So Nebuchadnezzar had his dream. It troubled him, so he pulled in all these supposed wise men, and he said, tell me my dream and give me the interpretation. But what they did is they were telling the king, You tell us the dream and we'll give you the interpretation. But the king was pretty savvy. He said no. He basically told them, if you're as wise as you think you are, if you are as wise as you say you are, you should be able to know what the dream is, and if you know the dream, then I can trust your interpretation. They told the king that's impossible, so he ordered all of them to be put to death. But Daniel managed to negotiate a stay of execution for all these men. He said he would consult and pray with his friends, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and ask the God of Israel to reveal the dream and its meaning to them. And the king agreed. So jumping down to verse 31, Daniel is telling the king his dream. Your Majesty, as you were watching, suddenly a colossal statue appeared. That statue, tall and dazzling, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was terrifying. The head of the statue was pure gold. Its chest and arms were silver, its stomach and thighs were bronze, its legs were iron, and its feet were partly iron and partly fired clay. As you were watching, a stone broke off without a hand touching it, struck the statue on its feet of iron and fired clay, and crushed them. Then the iron, the fired clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were shattered and became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away, and not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the entire earth. So God answered the prayers of Daniel, Mishael, Hananiah, and Azariah. He revealed both the dream and its meaning to Daniel. Here we just see Daniel telling the king what his dream was. And essentially the king saw a statue. It had a head of gold, chest and arms of silver, stomach and legs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of iron and baked clay mixed. And he also saw a small stone crush the feet of the statue. Once the feet were crushed, the statue could no longer stand, and all the other kingdoms fell. And now we come to the interpretation. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. Your Majesty, you are King of kings. The God of the heavens has given you sovereignty, power, strength, and glory. Wherever people live, or wild animals, or birds of the sky, he has handed them over to you and made you ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. After you there will arise another kingdom inferior to yours, and then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which will rule the whole earth. Now the text goes on to talk about the fourth and the fifth kingdoms, but I'm stopping here because we only want to look at these three kingdoms, these first three kingdoms in part one of this study. So Daniel tells the king that he is the head of gold. Him and his kingdom, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, are represented by the head of gold because the king is absolutely sovereign over everything, all of the known world at that time. And then Daniel tells the king, but that kingdom, his kingdom, will be replaced by a lesser kingdom, and this is represented by the chest and arms of silver. History will show us that this second kingdom is actually two kingdoms. First the Medes and then the Persians. These kingdoms will combine and become known as the Medo-Persian Empire. Now the next kingdom is represented by the stomach and the thighs of bronze. Once again, history will show us that this will be the Greek or Hellenistic Empire. These are the first three of the kingdoms and these are the ones we're going to look at because the fourth kingdom is incredibly complicated. The fifth kingdom, not so much. So Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Here's a recap of the dream and its interpretation. Okay, the head of gold is Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. This empire came into being around 626 BC, but it did not completely conquer Judah until 586 BC. Now, after the death of Nebuchadnezzar, his son-in-law, Nabonidus, assumed the throne and went off to lead the armies in defending the lands the empire already possessed and also trying to expand the Neo-Babylonian Empire. While he was doing this, his son, Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, Belshazzar, remained in Babylon. Dad left him in charge. What often happens when parents leave and leave teenagers in charge? I don't know if Belshazzar was a teenager or not, but he certainly behaved by one. Well, what do? They throw parties. So Belshazzar, he's throwing a party with his friends. Now, one night while he was getting drunk, he decides to get some sacred articles that were taken from the temple in Jerusalem by his grandfather. He fills them with alcohol, and everybody drinks from them, and they keep partying. Suddenly, a hand appears out of nowhere and writes on the plaster of the wall. No one knew the meaning. Belshazzar was encouraged to go get Daniel, a Hebrew who helped his granddad on spiritual matters. So Daniel came and told Belshazzar, "Hey dude, you messed up big time. The one true God was angry with you, and you are going to lose your life." Now the Bible goes on to tell us that Darius the Mede took over the kingdom after Belshazzar was killed in his bed that very night. So then, once Belshazzar was killed in his bed, then Darius the Mede takes over on behalf of the Mede Empire. But Darius the Mede was not in charge for very long. Cyrus the Great, the leader of the Persian Empire, conquered the Medes pretty quickly after that. He didn't destroy them, but he tried to integrate them into his empire, creating this Medo-Persian Empire. Now, although integrated, the Medes were never fully equal to the Persians. It was a lopsided alliance, and this lopsided alliance will be seen in Daniel's vision later when we take a look at chapter 7. Now, the next kingdom, represented by the stomach and the thighs of bronze, this was the Greek or Hellenistic Empire. And here we see the correct year. Alexander the Great became king in 336 BC at the age of 20. By the age of 23, he had conquered much of the known world at that time, and he died very young. The Hellenistic Empire, however, lasted another 300 years until 30 BC. When Alexander the Great conquered the known world, he started the process of Hellenization. That is, he made Greek the lingua franca. He wanted everybody to become Greek, basically. Now, lingua franca is the international language of diplomacy and trade, and then it was Greek. Today, it's between English and French. This process of Hellenization carried well into the 1st century AD, and it was the lingua franca when Jesus came and the apostles and the disciples, which is why the New Testament is written primarily in Koine Greek. Now, we're going to jump ahead now to Daniel chapter 7. His vision recorded in chapter 7, it parallels Nebuchadnezzar's dream. Now, although this chapter is chronologically after the death of Belshazzar, the vision obviously occurs before his death. That story where Belshazzar was partying with the temple artifacts and lost his life, that's in chapter 5. Here we're up in chapter 7. So it's not chronological, and that's okay. That doesn't particularly matter. And it doesn't suggest even anywhere in the text that this is a chronological listing of how and when the events occurred. But Daniel chapter 7, beginning in verse 1. In the first year of King Belshazzar of Babylon, Daniel had a dream with visions in his mind as he was lying in his bed. He wrote down the dream, and here is the summary of his account. Daniel said, "In my vision at night I was watching, and suddenly the 4 winds of heaven stirred up the great sea. 4 huge beasts came up from the sea, each different from the other. The first was like a lion, but had eagle's wings. I continued watching until its wings were torn off. It was lifted up from the ground, set on its feet like a man, and given a human mind. Suddenly another beast appeared, a second one that looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, 'Get up, gorge yourself on flesh.' After this, while I was watching, suddenly another beast appeared. It was like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. It had 4 heads, and it was given dominion." Now, Daniel wrote in this vision that he saw the 4 winds of the earth stir up the great sea. The 4 winds is like saying the 4 corners of the earth. It's metaphoric language, meaning the entire world. The sea, however, mentioned here is the Mediterranean Sea, but the Mediterranean Sea in prophecy is also symbolic of Gentile nations, since many of the Gentile nations mentioned in end times prophecies have a coastline somewhere on the Mediterranean. It says the first beast was like a lion but had eagle's wings. Like the head of gold on the statue, this beast represents Nebuchadnezzar and the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The second beast looked like a bear. It was raised up on one side. This shows the unequal balance of power between the Medes and the Persians in the Medo-Persian Empire, and it represents the Medo-Persian Empire. And they were never considered equal. The Medes were never considered equal with the Persians, even after Cyrus the Great incorporated them into his kingdom. The third beast was like a leopard with 4 wings of a bird on its back. This represents the Greek or Hellenistic Empire. Now, the leopard is an extremely fast animal, although it's not in the top 10 fastest land animals on Earth, but it's pretty quick. It relies more on stealth, and it relies more on power when it goes out to grab its prey. But this third beast, like a leopard with 4 wings on its back, again, that represents the Greek or Hellenistic Empire. Now, after Alexander the Great conquered much of the known world, he died at the age of 23. I think we already mentioned that. And then 4 of his generals took over different parts of his empire. They didn't get together and agree on them. They kind of did, but then they battled to have control over over who would control which part of his empire and how much. So the entire place was still a Hellenistic or Greek empire, but it was not just one, it was 4. So we can look again, and let me read verse 15. As for me, Daniel, my spirit was deeply distressed within me, and the visions in my mind terrified me. I approached one of those who were standing by, an angel, and asked him to clarify all this. So he let me know the interpretation of these things. These huge beasts, 4 in number, are 4 kings who will rise from the earth. But the holy ones of the Most High will receive the kingdom and possess it forever. Yes, forever and ever. So that's kind of the good news. This is a confirmation that what I've already mentioned, these 4 beasts represent 4 kingdoms, just as the 4 parts of the statue, represent 4 kingdoms that will rise up out of the land, but ultimately be defeated by the holy ones of the Most High, by God Himself. Now we'll take a look at Daniel's vision, and like we did with the prophetic dream. The first beast was like a lion, but it had eagle's wings, already mentioned, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire. The bear raised up on one side represents the Medo-Persian Empire, and the leopard with 4 wings on its back represents the Greek or Hellenistic Empire, both as a unified empire under Alexander the Great, but then as a divided empire, still Greek, under the 4 generals. Now, if we combine these 2 things, we can see head of gold and the lion that had eagle's wings, again, Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonian Empire, chest and arms of silver from the statue, and the bear raised up on one side, Medo-Persian Empire, the stomach and thighs of bronze, and like a leopard with 4 wings on its back, the Greek or Hellenistic Empire. Now, when the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which is represented by those 2 things, the head of gold, Daniel chapter 2, the lion with the eagle's wings, Daniel chapter 7, you've seen this map before. This shows the extent of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. When they were conquered by the Persians, slightly different map, this is the Persian Empire at its peak, and it occupies all of the previously land held by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and it actually is a larger area. And then the Greek Empire, just about almost nearly identical. We'll take another quick look at the Persian, nearly identical to what the Greek Empire occupied, and that was represented by the stomach and thighs of bronze, Daniel chapter 2, and the leopard with the 4 wings. And now we come to those 4 kings, the successors of Alexander the Great. These are Cassander, who had southeastern Europe up there in the top left part of the screen, Antigonus, who has Syria and Iran and Iraq and parts east, Ptolemy, who had control over Egypt, and Seleucus, who for the most part maintained control over the Holy Land and parts of Jordan. Now, the Seleucids are probably the most important of the four generals when it comes to salvation history or the history of the times of the Gentiles. When the Seleucids had control over Israel, they allowed the Jews to continue to practice their faith. But when Antiochus IV Epiphanes came into power, he tried to force this Hellenization process on the Jews, and this led to the Maccabean revolt around 167 BC. After a couple of years of fighting, the Jews were successful in defeating the Seleucids, and they took control of their land and the city of Jerusalem for another 100 years or so. So after they defeated the Seleucids, the Jews found that they only had enough consecrated oil to keep the temple menorah burning for one day. And they started the process of consecrating more oil. That process took a total of 8 days, and miraculously, the 1 day of oil burned for the 8 days it took them to consecrate more oil so they could keep the menorah burning. The Jews celebrate this as Hanukkah, or the Feast of the Dedication. So we've seen what has led up. Now, this is all like the first three kingdoms of the times of the Gentiles: Neo-Babylonian, Medo-Persian, Hellenistic, or Greek Empire. These have all come and gone. Now, this is going to kind of wrap this up now because the Fourth Empire, imperialism, is a little bit too complex. It would make this study way too long. We're going to look at that next week. But just to kind of give you a heads up, the Fourth Empire, we're saying it's imperialism. It unfolds in 5 stages. The first stage is the United Stage. It's the Roman Empire that started in, as far as it concerns Israel, it kicks off in 63 BC when Pompey conquered Jerusalem. And the Roman Empire existed till about AD 364. It was then that there was a 2-division stage. The emperor at the time, Valentinian, he split the Roman Empire into East and West around 364 AD. Now, interestingly enough, there was a church schism 700 some years later, or close to 700 years later, where there was an Eastern-Western split between the church. And it's pretty much falls in line with this political division between the Roman Empire in the West, the Roman Empire in the East. The thing that caused that schism was there were bishops in many of the cities around the world, and there was a bishop of Rome who was the top bishop and later became known as the Pope, and then there was bishops in other places. Well, the bishop in Turkey, I believe it was, and that would have been Constantinople, when Constantine made the Roman Empire a Christian nation, that they thought that Constantinople should be the seat of the church. And so for a period of time there were 2 popes. But then this split ended up being between what we now know as the Roman Catholic Church against the Eastern Orthodox churches. And that's that Eastern-Western split. All these are part of history. What's yet to be fulfilled under this Fourth Empire of imperialism is a one world government stage, a 10-division stage, and the Antichrist stage. Those are kingdoms that will come as part of the 5 stages of this Fourth Empire of imperialism. So that is a quick overview. I wanted to try to get it onto a video for those of you who were not able to make it the prior Monday. You don't have to watch this if you don't want to, but I thought I would make it available to you so that as we launch into the second part of the study and look at the times of the Gentiles, that Fourth Empire in 5 stages, you'll understand the whole timeline. So that's it. I hope this was helpful. If not, you can always hit pause, delete, not watch it. It's all entirely up to you.